In the spring of 67 AD, the Roman general Vespasian launched his invasion of Galilee. His force, numbering nearly 6,000 men, struck fear into the local Jewish defenders gathered near Sepphoris, who had no desire to meet the Roman legions in open battle. The citizens of Sepphoris had already reached out to Vespasian for protection, and he responded by sending a strong detachment, 1,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry, under the command of the tribune Placidus. These Roman divisions raided the surrounding countryside relentlessly, creating serious problems for Josephus, who now commanded the Jewish forces. In retaliation, Josephus attempted to attack Sepphoris, but his efforts failed. As morale weakened, many of Josephus's men deserted and fled to nearby fortresses. Left with a diminished force, he retreated to Tiberias. His arrival there alarmed the townspeople, who realized that if their commander had abandoned the field, victory against Rome must be hopeless. Josephus himself was now torn between resistance and surrender. He sent a message to Jerusalem, describing the desperate situation, neither exaggerating the strength of the Romans nor concealing it, urging the council to either send reinforcements or grant him permission to negotiate peace. Before any reply arrived, devastating news reached him. Gabara, a nearby village about 19 kilometers inland from Ptolemais, had been utterly destroyed. Every inhabitant was slaughtered or enslaved, and the neighboring settlements were also ravaged. Vespasian's strategy was clear: crush morale through terror and force the rebels to fight or surrender on Roman terms. Yet even after this massacre, the Jewish resistance refused to yield. The key to Galilee's defense was the hill fortress of Jotapata, perched on the rugged northwestern heights of Lower Galilee. Naturally fortified by deep ravines and sheer cliffs, it was a stronghold of both geography and resolve. The Romans understood its importance. Taking Jotapata would mean taking Galilee itself. Placidus, eager for glory, had already tried to seize the town, but his troops were ambushed by its defenders and soundly defeated. Determined to finish what his tribune had failed to do, Vespasian ordered his engineers to level the surrounding ground and prepare for siege operations. Josephus, who had previously strengthened the fortress and garrisoned it heavily, rushed there from Tiberias to take command of the defense. Soon, Placidus and his cavalry encircled the hills to prevent escape, and the main army followed, setting up camp to the north. A full line of infantry and cavalry tightened around the town, cutting it off from the outside world. The defenders, including civilians, were trapped. Their fate was clear: surrender, enslavement, or death. The Romans began their assault almost at once. Vespasian relied on intimidation, using his vast army to break the spirit of the defenders, most of whom were poorly armed peasants wielding makeshift weapons. This psychological warfare, if successful, would save time, money, and lives ahead of the eventual campaign against Jerusalem. For 5 days, the Romans bombarded the walls with missiles and launched repeated infantry assaults. Josephus countered with surprise attacks, sending out small groups to strike at the enemy lines and retreat before they could be surrounded. The casualties were relatively light on both sides, but the stalemate favored the defenders. Unable to breach the fortress, Vespasian called his officers to a council of war. It was clear that brute force would not win the day. Jotapata was too well positioned and too fiercely defended. The Romans would need to build siege works. An immense ramp of earth, timber, and stone began to rise from the valley floor toward the northern wall. Thousands of soldiers were put to labor, cutting trees, hauling stones, and packing earth to fill the ravines. The effort required staggering resources, food, water, and materials to sustain the massive army. Yet the defenders were far from passive. From the walls they hurled missiles and made daring night sorties, tearing down Roman screens, setting fire to timber supports, and killing work parties whenever they could. To counter this, Vespasian ordered the hurdles to be fastened into one continuous barrier, creating a wall of protection across his front lines. Gradually, the Jewish defenders were forced to remain behind their walls, unable to risk open attacks. As the Roman ramp grew, its top came level with the walls of Jotapata, and siege engines were brought forward for the final assault. Realizing the danger, Josephus ordered his masons to raise the height of the northern wall even further. They worked in relays day and night, protected by hides stretched over wooden frames to shield them from missiles. Soon, the walls towered nearly 10 meters high, reinforced by new battlements and watchtowers from which defenders could rain projectiles down upon the attackers below. The morale of the Romans wavered while confidence grew among the Jews, who resumed their counterattacks with renewed energy. Vespasian, frustrated by the stalemate, changed tactics. He ordered a blockade to starve the defenders into submission. The fortress still had stores of grain and food, but water was scarce. There was no spring within the walls, only rainwater stored in rock-cut cisterns, and the dry season was at its height. With refugees crowding into the town, supplies ran dangerously low. Yet Josephus once again showed cunning. He first proposed leading a breakout to seek reinforcements, but the townspeople refused, fearing he would desert them. So he devised a ruse. He ordered his men to wash their garments and hang them along the walls to dry. When Vespasian's scouts saw the damp clothes gleaming in the sun, they assumed the town still had abundant water. Believing the siege might drag on indefinitely, the Roman general shifted from waiting to direct assault once again. As the ramp neared completion, the Romans rolled forward their massive battering ram, protected by archers and catapults that rained missiles on the walls. Blow after blow struck the same section, and the masonry began to give way. Seeing the danger, Josephus improvised another defense. He filled large sacks with rags and straw, lowering them over the targeted section of the wall to absorb the impact. Each time the ram struck, the sacks muffled the force of the blows, and wherever the Romans shifted their attack, the defenders moved the sacks to meet them. This ingenious tactic slowed the Roman advance and prolonged the defense, turning Jotapata into a symbol of desperate resistance against overwhelming might. The Romans quickly countered by fastening long poles with curved blades at the ends, slicing through the ropes that held the sacks. With no other option left, Josephus and his men decided to set the Roman siege works on fire. Gathering every dry piece of wood they could find, they rushed out from 3 sides of the town, igniting the engines, shelters, and wooden supports. The flames raged for nearly an hour, consuming much of the Roman equipment. From the battlements above, defenders poured volleys of missiles onto the panicked soldiers below. Josephus mentions one warrior whose courage deserved eternal memory: Eleazar, son of Sameas, from Saba in Galilee. He lifted an enormous stone and hurled it down with such force that it shattered the head of the battering ram. Then, leaping from the walls, he seized the iron head of the ram and carried it calmly to the base of the ramp. Every Roman nearby turned their weapons toward him. 5 arrows pierced his body, yet he still climbed back up the wall. For a brief moment he stood there, a symbol of defiance, before collapsing, still clutching the ram's head in his hands. Josephus also records two brothers, Netiras and Philip, who charged directly into the lines of the 10th Legion, scattering soldiers and breaking their formation. As evening fell, the Romans repaired their ram and brought it once again against the weakened wall. During this attack, an arrow struck Vespasian in the foot, causing alarm in the Roman camp. Titus, his son, rushed to his side, but the general quickly composed himself and reassured his men, which only reignited their determination. Enraged, the Roman legions surged forward to renew the assault. Despite being bombarded by waves of missiles, the Jewish defenders stood firm on the battlements, continuing to fight fiercely. The fires they had set earlier now worked against them, illuminating their silhouettes for Roman archers. Stones hurled from siege engines smashed towers and walls with devastating power. Josephus describes the gruesome aftermath: men torn apart, blood running through the trenches, and piles of bodies forming a grim pathway up the ruined wall. By morning, the fortification finally gave way, and a massive breach opened. At dawn, Vespasian launched his final assault. 3 cavalry units advanced first, clearing the way with lowered lances while infantry pressed from behind. Archers and slingers filled the air with projectiles, darkening the sky. Behind them, heavily armored soldiers carried ladders to scale the remaining walls, hoping to draw the defenders away from the main breach. Josephus ordered the older and weary men to guard the intact portions of the wall, while the strongest were stationed at the breach. He instructed his soldiers to block out the Roman war cry by covering their ears and to crouch low during the incoming barrage. When the ramps were laid, they were to spring up and engage in close combat. He even locked the women inside their homes to prevent their cries from breaking the men's resolve. Soon, the Roman archers unleashed an endless rain of arrows and stones. Advancing up the earthen platform, the legionaries moved in their tortoise formation, shields locked tightly above and around them, forming an unbroken shell. Slow and methodical, they pushed forward step by step. The defenders fought desperately, but the Romans, advancing in deep ranks, began to press them back toward the breach. Suddenly, streams of boiling oil cascaded down from the walls, seeping between the shields of the tortoise and scalding the men beneath. The soldiers screamed in agony as the burning liquid penetrated their armor. Quickly, the centurions at the rear formed a second tortoise, thinking the oil would soon run out. They were right, but the defenders followed up with another trick. They poured down a cold mixture of fenugreek paste, which turned the wooden ramps into a slippery trap. The soldiers lost their footing, slipping and trampling one another, while others were struck down by missiles from above. The assault collapsed into chaos. Terrified, the Romans pulled back, and Vespasian called off the attack. Jotapata had survived another month. The prolonged resistance inspired other fortified towns across Galilee to rise up. When the city of Jaffa rebelled, Vespasian dispatched the commander of the 10th Legion with 2,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. The town was stormed, its defenders massacred, and only a handful of women and children taken as slaves. Meanwhile, at Jotapata, the Romans resumed their work. The ramps were raised higher than the walls, and 3 massive wooden towers were built atop them, allowing archers to shoot down upon the defenders. The Jews could barely approach their own walls without being struck. Their only option was to launch desperate sorties, brave but costly attacks that achieved little. One night, a deserter escaped from the city and revealed to Vespasian that the guards on the walls often fell asleep just before dawn. Acting on this intelligence, the general ordered his son Titus to lead a stealth attack with a small force. Before sunrise on July 1st, Titus and his men scaled the walls, silently killing the drowsy sentries. The gates were thrown open, and the waiting soldiers surged in. The Romans quickly overran the northern hill and poured into the city. Panic spread like wildfire. Some defenders trapped on the far side of the ridge saw no escape and took their own lives. Those who barricaded themselves in a northern tower held out briefly, but were soon surrounded. Exhausted and hopeless, they surrendered, stretching out their necks to the enemy's swords. As the Romans advanced, the townspeople fled in terror, many hiding in underground cisterns. The men were slaughtered, women and children enslaved, and the once proud city was reduced to ruins. Josephus, however, managed to hide in a deep pit connected to a concealed cave with provisions for several days. 40 other prominent men accompanied him. Each night, he crept out in search of an escape route, but found none. On the third day, the hiding place was discovered. Vespasian offered him his life in exchange for surrender, and Josephus seemed ready to accept. Yet his companions refused, preferring death to captivity. After a long, impassioned argument urging them not to commit suicide, Josephus reluctantly agreed to their proposal. A death lottery. Each man drew lots to determine who would die next. One by one, they killed each other until only Josephus and one other remained. Having cleverly counted the circle, Josephus ensured he would survive. The two men surrendered to the Romans. Brought before Vespasian and Titus, Josephus was spared execution. Instead, he made a startling declaration. He told Vespasian that he was no ordinary prisoner, but a messenger of destiny, that the general and his son would one day rule the world. Vespasian was skeptical at first, suspecting a desperate ruse. But when Josephus's earlier prediction that Jotapata would fall in 47 days proved true, the general began to believe him. From that moment on, Josephus lived under the protection of Vespasian. Though still a captive, he was treated with respect and accompanied both Vespasian and Titus throughout the remainder of the war. His refusal to die alongside his comrades later took on a moral and religious dimension. He argued that life was sacred, that suicide was forbidden, and that he had a divine mission to survive and bear witness to the fate of his people. It is striking that Josephus never mentioned the episode in the cave within his other version of the Jotapata story in life. In the Jewish War, however, he clearly aimed to clear himself of accusations of betrayal. This section of his writing seems crafted for the moderate Jewish audience, those who might still accept him as credible. His purpose was not to convince the zealots, who would never have forgiven what they saw as treachery, but to win back the respect of those who were not consumed by fanaticism. The fall of Jotapata in early July marked a turning point in the Galilean campaign. With several months of good weather still ahead, the Romans had ample time to eliminate any remaining resistance. The psychological impact of Jotapata's defeat shattered Jewish morale, especially in Lower Galilee, where organized resistance quickly crumbled. Only a few strongholds held out: Gishala in the north, Tarichiah and Tiberias near the Sea of Galilee, Mount Tabor inland, and Gamala High in the Golan region. While the siege of Jotapata was still underway, Vespasian dispatched Trajan, commander of the 10th Legion, with a force of 1,000 cavalry and 2,000 infantry to suppress the nearby town of Jaffa. Encouraged by the rebellion at Jotapata, Jaffa had also risen up against Rome. The town was naturally well defended, surrounded by rugged terrain and protected by 2 concentric walls. When Trajan's forces arrived, the inhabitants marched out to meet them, seemingly ready for battle. Trajan charged without hesitation, scattering the defenders and chasing them back toward their gates. The fleeing rebels managed to reach the first wall, but as they tried to enter the second enclosure, their own townspeople, terrified that the Romans might follow, shut them out. Trapped between the Roman troops behind them and the locked gates before them, they were slaughtered where they stood. Josephus claims 12,000 Jews were killed in the assault. Trajan then requested reinforcements, and Titus, Vespasian's son, was sent with additional troops, 500 cavalry and 1,000 infantry. Taking command of the right wing, Titus led the charge up the ramparts. Fierce fighting erupted within the narrow streets of the city. Men clashed hand to hand in the alleys, while women hurled stones and tiles from the rooftops. After 6 hours of brutal struggle, resistance collapsed. Those who survived the initial slaughter were massacred or enslaved. The violence did not end there. The Samaritans soon faced the same fate. Although the region of Samaria was already under Roman control, many of its inhabitants had gathered atop their sacred mountain, Mount Gerizim, refusing to leave. Their refusal was taken as a sign of rebellion. Vespasian ordered Cerealis, commander of the 5th Legion, to deal with them. With 600 cavalry and 3,000 infantry, Cerealis surrounded the mountain, cutting off all access to water. Under the relentless sun, thirst and exhaustion forced the Samaritans to descend, and when they did, they were mercilessly cut down. After these campaigns, Vespasian returned to Ptolemais to allow his troops to rest. He established permanent bases in the non-Jewish cities of Caesarea and Scythopolis, both loyal to Rome. His first objective was to secure sea routes. The rebels had retaken Joppa after Gallus's earlier defeat and had turned it into a pirate haven, threatening Rome's vital grain shipments and Mediterranean communication lines. A small Roman force recaptured the port with ease, re-establishing control. Caesarea now became Vespasian's main base of operations. Its strategic harbor ensured steady supplies, and its position allowed easy movement toward both Galilee in the northeast and Judea in the south. From there, Vespasian moved across Galilee toward Caesarea Philippi, near the northern edge of King Agrippa's territories. Agrippa himself requested Roman assistance in regaining control over his client states, several of which had joined the rebellion. Tiberias and Tarichaea were both in rebel hands, though Tiberias was divided. Many of its citizens favored peace with Rome. Earlier that year, Josephus had mediated between the radical faction led by Jesus ben Saphius and the pro-Herodian nobles seeking to surrender. Vespasian sent Titus back to Caesarea to bring up the remaining troops to Scythopolis, where the two armies rejoined. From there, they marched toward Tiberias, setting camp a short distance from the city. An officer was sent ahead to negotiate surrender. The revolutionary leader, Jesus ben Saphius, responded with open defiance, leading his men out to attack the Romans. But the city's royalists and wealthy elites immediately defected, leaving the rebels isolated. Realizing they could not hold Tiberias, the insurgents fled north toward Tarichaea. The next morning, Tiberias opened its gates and welcomed the Roman legions without resistance. With that, Galilee was effectively subdued. The rebellion in the north was over. Only Jerusalem remained to be conquered, and the decisive battle for the heart of Judea was about to begin. The rebel stronghold at Tarichaea grew more powerful than ever as new fighters poured in, determined to make their last stand against Rome. Josephus had fortified the city with strong defensive walls, and along the lakeshore, the rebels had gathered a fleet of small boats to serve as an escape route if the land defenses collapsed. Meanwhile, Vespasian's army encamped just to the south, quickly surrounding their camp with heavy fortifications. As the Romans worked to strengthen their positions, the rebel leader Jesus and his companions launched a sudden attack. They charged out of the gates and surprised the Roman engineers, scattering them and tearing down part of their defenses. But when the legionaries began to form ranks, the rebels quickly retreated toward the city. Pursued by the Romans, many ran to the shore and took to their boats, rowing just far enough out into the lake to stay within range of their bows. There they anchored, linking their vessels together side by side to form a floating battle line, hurling arrows and stones toward the soldiers on shore in what became a desperate and chaotic fight across water and land. To counter this strange battle, Vespasian placed 2,000 archers under the command of Antonius Silo on a hill overlooking the city. On the plain below, a large number of Jewish fighters had gathered, and Titus was sent with 600 cavalry to drive them off. When Titus realized the size of the opposing force, he sent for help. Trajan soon arrived with 400 more horsemen. Together they charged the rebels head-on. For a time, the Jews fought bravely, but against the armored Roman cavalry they had little chance. Many were cut down, while others fled back to Tarichaea. Titus pressed forward, circling the edge of the lake and cutting off their escape before forcing his way into the city. Inside, the slaughter was brutal. Jesus and a handful of his followers managed to escape across the countryside, but most of the inhabitants were killed or enslaved. To prevent further escapes, Vespasian sealed the city with a cordon of troops and ordered the construction of rafts to pursue those who had fled by water. A fierce naval battle followed on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. The rebels' boats, small fishing craft hastily converted for war, were no match for the sturdy Roman rafts. Protected by armor and shields, Roman archers unleashed volleys of arrows that tore through the unprotected Jewish sailors. One by one, the small boats were rammed and overturned. Those who tried to swim ashore were met by waiting soldiers who struck them down as they reached the banks. When the fighting ended, the lake was thick with wreckage and floating bodies, the sun baking the scene into a nauseating spectacle of defeat. Afterward, Vespasian separated the captives. The local citizens loyal to King Agrippa were spared and returned to their ruler, while the rest, those considered insurgents, were taken to Tiberias for judgment. 6,000 of the strongest young men were sent as slave labor to work on the canal at Corinth. The rest were sold to slave traders, and about 1,000 elderly or infirm captives, deemed useless, were executed. Only 3 of Josephus's fortified positions now remained: Gishala, Gamala, and Mount Tabor, all in northern Palestine. Determined to crush the last pockets of resistance, Vespasian marched on Gamala, a fortress perched high in the Golan Heights. The town stood on a steep, narrow ridge, its houses clinging to the slopes, so precarious. Originally, Gamala had been garrisoned by Agrippa's troops to keep the local population under control. But when Agrippa unwisely withdrew his soldiers, the Jews seized the fortress. When he later tried to retake it, his siege dragged on for 7 long months, giving the defenders, mainly refugees from Galilee, time to prepare formidable defenses. Vespasian was determined to end the stalemate. He surrounded the city with 3 legions, the 15th to the north, the 5th in the center, and the 10th to the south. Each was ordered to build siege ramps to create level ground for their assault. The defenders tried repeatedly to disrupt the work, but were driven back by Roman artillery fire. When Agrippa himself approached the walls to persuade the defenders to surrender, he was greeted not with words, but with a sling stone that struck his arm and wounded him. Soon, the Roman siege works were complete. The battering rams went to work, smashing great holes through the outer walls. Legionaries poured through the breaches, only to find themselves trapped in a maze of narrow streets. The defenders lured them deeper into the town and then struck from above, hurling stones, spears, and boiling oil. The Romans, unable to maneuver in tight alleys, fell into confusion. Panic spread as soldiers tried to retreat through the crowded streets, trampling one another in their desperation. Many clambered onto rooftops, only for the structures to collapse under their weight, burying them alive in rubble. From the heights, the Jews rained missiles upon the chaos below. The Roman advance broke down completely, and only the discipline of a small group around Vespasian himself prevented total disaster. Surrounded and cut off near the ridge, the general and his men formed a defensive wall of shields and slowly fought their way back to safety. The legions eventually regrouped outside the walls, but the setback left them demoralized and shaken. Realizing the need to restore order, Vespasian addressed his men, reminding them of their past victories and urging them to stand firm. "Fortune," he told them, "may shift its favor from one side to another, but it will not abandon Rome." His words reignited their fighting spirit, and work resumed on the siege platforms, which were raised higher than before. Inside Gamala, joy over the unexpected Roman defeat soon gave way to despair. The people understood that their situation was hopeless. Supplies were running low, and there was no way to break through the blockade. Hunger and exhaustion were setting in. Still, the bravest among them took their places at the breaches, while the rest guarded the remaining walls. As the Romans continued to strengthen their siege works, some of the inhabitants began fleeing down the ravines or through hidden tunnels in a desperate attempt to escape. While Gamala endured its siege, Vespasian turned briefly to another stronghold, Mount Tabor, which rose between the Great Plain and Scythopolis. This fortress, originally fortified by Josephus, was surrounded by walls and stocked with food and water, making it a secure and stubborn outpost that the Romans could not ignore. Vespasian sent his general Placidus with 600 cavalry to deal with the rebels holding Mount Tabor. The steep ascent made a direct attack impossible, so Placidus decided on a ruse. He called out to the people gathered on the mountain, offering them safe passage and fair terms if they would come down peacefully. The crowd seemed to agree, descending cautiously, but their true intention was to strike the Romans once they reached the plain. Placidus pretended to retreat, luring the would-be attackers into the open, then suddenly turned his cavalry around and charged. The result was a massacre. Most of the rebels were cut down, while the rest were captured. Those who had remained on the mountain, terrified by what they saw below, surrendered. Mount Tabor fell without further resistance. Meanwhile, at Gamala, desperation grew. Some townspeople tried to flee through the ravines. Others perished from hunger, while the most determined continued to man the defenses. On the night of November 9th, about a month into the siege, 3 soldiers of the 15th Legion crept up to one of the city's towers under cover of darkness. Working quietly, they loosened the 5 massive foundation stones at its base. When the structure gave way, the tower crashed to the ground with a thunderous roar. Panic erupted inside the town, but the Romans waited until morning before pressing the attack. At dawn, Titus returned from another campaign and led 200 dismounted cavalrymen and several infantry units into the city. They advanced silently, catching the guards unprepared. Chaos spread instantly. Families ran through the streets screaming. parents dragging children toward the citadel, while others fell under Roman swords. Josephus later described the horrific scene, the streets running red with blood, the cries of the dying echoing down the slopes, and the city drowning in terror. Vespasian soon brought up the main force through a breach in the eastern wall. The last defenders, together with their families, retreated up the steep cliffs overlooking the town and hurled missiles at the advancing Romans. Then nature turned against them. A fierce wind swept across the ridge, scattering their projectiles and nearly throwing some of the defenders off balance. Encircled on all sides, the Jews fought on with incredible bravery, but the outcome was inevitable. The Romans climbed steadily upward, cutting down anyone in their path. What followed became legend. Ancient writers later called Gamala the Masada of the Golan. Josephus claimed that when all hope was lost, many of the inhabitants hurled themselves from the cliffs rather than be taken captive. 4,000 killed by Roman swords, and another 5,000 dying by their own hands. Yet modern excavations suggest the story may have been more tragic than heroic. Archaeologists have shown that only a small area at the summit is high enough for a fatal fall, far too small to hold thousands of people. More likely, the desperate townsfolk tried to escape down the steep northern slope, trampling one another in their panic. Only a handful reached safety in the ravine below. Josephus mentions that just 2 women survived, nieces of a nobleman named Philip, once commander-in-chief under King Agrippa. No human remains were ever found during 14 seasons of excavation at Gamala. This is probably because, once the battle ended, Jewish law required the burial of the dead, and the Romans likely permitted it. The bodies were almost certainly interred in a mass grave nearby, as a similar burial site discovered at Jotapata seems to confirm. With Gamala destroyed, the Roman conquest of Galilee was nearly complete. Only Gishala still stood in defiance. As winter approached, Vespasian ordered his legions to withdraw to their bases at Caesarea and Scythopolis, but he sent his son Titus with 1,000 cavalry to deal with the final pocket of resistance. Gishala's people were mostly farmers and tradesmen who wanted peace. But John of Gishala had stirred them to rebellion and now stood alone against Rome. The town's defenses were weak, and Titus could have taken it by storm, but he chose mercy over bloodshed. Hoping to avoid another massacre, he offered terms of surrender, then withdrew to allow the townspeople to give their answer after the Sabbath. John, however, used the delay to his advantage. He planned to abandon the city under cover of darkness and march south to join the defense of Jerusalem. Taking advantage of Titus's goodwill and the lack of a Roman blockade, John led his militia out during the night. The townspeople, mostly women and children, followed in despair, crying out to their husbands not to leave them behind, but the orders were clear. The fighters were to flee. Josephus records John's words to his men: "Save yourselves and live to avenge those who fall." The next morning, Titus arrived expecting peace talks. The gates were opened, and the people greeted him as a liberator. They told him that John and his soldiers had escaped during the night, and begged him for mercy. Titus immediately dispatched his cavalry in pursuit. They caught some of the fleeing rebels, killing about 6,000 and capturing 3,000 women and children. But John himself reached Jerusalem safely. Inside Gishala, Titus ordered part of the wall torn down to mark the town's capture. He chose not to execute those accused of rebellion, threatening them instead, reasoning that punishment without proof would only breed resentment. After stationing a garrison to maintain order, Titus returned to his father's winter camp, where preparations for the great assault on Jerusalem were already underway. Yet before that decisive campaign, Roman attention turned to eliminating every remaining stronghold across the land. With the north and west subdued, Vespasian and Titus moved to crush resistance in the east and south, in Perea and Idumea, until only the region surrounding Jerusalem remained defiant. By this time, Samaria and the Sharon Plain were also under Roman control. Though the Samaritans had a long history of rebellion against foreign rulers, their deep divisions with the Jews made any alliance impossible. Still, they too suffered under Roman rule, and unrest flared from time to time. Decades earlier, in AD 36, a Samaritan prophet had led his followers to Mount Gerizim, their sacred mountain, in open defiance of the Roman governor. Now, during the Jewish revolt, Vespasian again received reports of a gathering there. Fearing another uprising, he sent the 5th Legion with 3,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. The Samaritans retreated to the mountaintop, but without food or water, their position was hopeless. By late June, weakened by thirst and heat, many tried to flee down the slopes, only to be cut down. The Romans stormed the summit and massacred the rest. From that day forward, Samaria remained silent under Roman rule. A similar fate befell the Jewish settlements of the Sharon Plain. Early in the rebellion, Greek communities in cities like Caesarea and Ascalon had carried out brutal massacres of their Jewish neighbors. Roman forces followed up with devastating counterattacks, burning Joppa to the ground. Even so, the Jewish victory at Beth Horon had briefly revived the revolutionary spirit. Encouraged, Ananus and his council in Jerusalem sent troops to attack Ascalon. The Roman garrison was small, barely 500 infantry and a few cavalry, but the defenders were veterans. When the untrained Jewish levies met them on the plain, the result was predictable. Discipline and armor triumphed over passion and makeshift weapons. The Jewish force was routed, losing 2 commanders in the fight. Undeterred, they tried again, marching on Ascalon a second time, only to fall into ambushes set in the nearby passes. Once more, Roman cavalry crushed them. Meanwhile, rebels seized Joppa and rebuilt it as their base of operations on the coast. From there, they launched raids across the Sharon Plain and soon took to the sea, turning pirate. By the following year, Jewish ships were attacking Roman trade routes between Egypt and Syria, a final burst of defiance before the storm that was soon to fall on Jerusalem itself. After the fall of Jotapata, Vespasian dispatched a contingent of soldiers and cavalry to seize control of the coastal city of Joppa. Taking advantage of the night, the Romans entered the city with little resistance. Astonishingly, its walls had been left undefended. The Jewish fighters, realizing their peril, fled to their ships and waited just offshore, hoping to escape by sea. But fate turned against them. A sudden, violent storm swept in from the north, and since Joppa lacked a natural harbor, the waves hurled the ships against one another and smashed them upon the jagged rocks along the shore. The result was catastrophic. Many drowned in the raging waters. Others were crushed in the wreckage or slaughtered on the beaches as they struggled to reach land. Roman troops were waiting along the coastline, cutting down any survivors who managed to crawl from the surf. When the storm finally passed, the sea was littered with debris and bodies. Joppa was secured without further resistance. The Romans established a garrison there and plundered the surrounding villages, leaving the entire region in ruins. Yet even after these defeats, the spirit of rebellion was not entirely extinguished. Isolated groups of fighters still resisted across the plains. According to Josephus, Vespasian had to subdue Jamnia and Azotus before he could finally declare the coastal territories pacified. By this time, nearly half of Judea had fallen under Roman control. The remaining Jewish resistance was confined to the heartlands, Judea itself, Perea and Idumea, now surrounded by Roman legions pressing in from the north and west. The rebellion was cornered, and the last act of the war was about to begin. The stage was set for the final and most brutal confrontation: the siege of Jerusalem. When John entered Jerusalem, he was greeted by anxious crowds eager to hear what had happened in Galilee. The rebels claimed they had not been defeated by the Romans, insisting instead that they had chosen to preserve their strength for the defense of the holy city. They argued that fighting for Gishala would have been reckless when Jerusalem, the heart of their nation, needed protection. Yet when reports of massacres and destruction reached the people, fear quickly replaced confidence, and talk of the Romans advancing upon the capital spread throughout the city. John began to stir up unrest, telling the people that the Romans were not as powerful as they appeared, and that the walls of Jerusalem would hold firm where Galilee had fallen. His fiery speeches inspired many of the city's young men to take up arms, believing that victory against Rome was still possible. But not everyone shared this enthusiasm. Many citizens recognized the danger of an open confrontation with the empire and urged peace. Soon, Jerusalem was divided into factions, one calling for resistance, the other pleading for reconciliation. This division was not limited to the city. Across Judea, internal strife spread like wildfire. Armed groups roamed the countryside, plundering villages and attacking their own countrymen. In time, their violence became indistinguishable from that of the Roman invaders. These factions eventually made their way to Jerusalem, seeking refuge within its walls. Religious law forbade the exclusion of fellow Jews, so the gates were opened to them. But food was scarce, and the influx of fighters and their families worsened the city's condition. The newcomers soon turned to robbery and murder, targeting the wealthy and powerful. Their leader, Eleazar ben Simon, who had already fortified himself on the Temple Mount, took advantage of the growing anger toward the city's aristocracy. With the arrival of John and his Galilean fighters, the radicals grew bolder. They ousted the current high priest, Matthias ben Theophilos, and replaced him using what they called an ancient custom: selection by lot. The man chosen, Phanny, son of Samuel, was a simple villager unfamiliar with the sacred duties of his new office. The rebels mocked the ceremony, dressing him in priestly robes, while the legitimate priests looked on in sorrow, lamenting the desecration of their faith. The chaos only deepened. The rebels began imprisoning or killing members of noble families, accusing them of collaboration with Rome. Antipas, a royal official, and other distinguished men were executed under false pretenses. Panic swept through the city. Leaders such as Gorion ben Joseph, Simeon ben Gamaliel, and the high priests Jesus ben Gamlas and Ananus ben Ananus urged the council to take action. Ananus, the senior priest, finally organized an uprising to drive the zealots from the temple. The zealots fortified themselves within the sanctuary, while Ananus gathered forces from the city's elite youth to confront them. Fierce fighting broke out across Jerusalem, in the streets, the valleys, and around the temple. Stones and arrows filled the air, and soon the combat turned to brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Many were slain before the zealots retreated into the inner courts of the temple, barricading themselves behind its gates. Ananus's men surrounded them, but refrained from storming the sacred area, instead posting thousands of guards around the temple to contain them. Amid the chaos, other militias in the city stood aside, waiting to see which faction would prevail. Sensing an opportunity, Ananus secretly sent a message to Vespasian, inviting him to intervene and restore order. In his address to the people, he lamented that Romans, for all their cruelty, had shown more respect for Jewish law than the rebels who defiled their own holy places. The moderate leaders, Ananus, Josephus, and others, still hoped to secure peace and restore some form of royal authority under Rome, perhaps through a client ruler like Herod Agrippa. But the internal collapse of Jerusalem made that dream impossible. The city's leadership was paralyzed, its factions consumed by mistrust. Josephus later blamed John of Gishala for the downfall of Ananus's party, accusing him of playing both sides, pretending loyalty to the priestly leaders by day, only to sneak away at night to the zealots' camp and report their every move. His deceit, disguised as devotion, spread suspicion and paranoia, further deepening the rift that would soon destroy Jerusalem from within. John swore an oath of loyalty to Ananus and the people, promising that he would not betray their plans. Trusting him completely, Ananus welcomed him without suspicion and even appointed him as an intermediary to negotiate peace with the zealots, hoping to preserve the sanctity of the temple. Yet John, acting as a double agent, warned the zealots that Ananus and his council were plotting to hand Jerusalem over to the Romans. He claimed that a delegation had already been sent to Vespasian to invite him into the city, stirring fear and anger among his listeners. Pretending concern for their safety, John urged the zealots to seek allies beyond the city walls, particularly the Idumeans. The zealot leaders Eleazar ben Gion and Zacharias, both priests by birth, accepted John's deceitful proposal. They sent a letter to the Idumeans, warning them that Ananus was planning to betray Jerusalem to the Romans. The Idumeans responded at once, sending a formidable army of about 20,000 men, led by 4 generals: John, James ben Sosas, Simon ben Theseus, and Phineas ben Cluseth. When they reached Jerusalem, Ananus ordered the city gates closed and posted guards along the walls. He tried to reason with them, sending Jesus, his second in command, to speak from a nearby tower, but the Idumeans refused to disarm or turn against their zealot allies. Denied entry, they were forced to camp outside the walls, enduring a violent storm through the night with only their shields for shelter. Josephus later described the storm as an ominous sign from heaven, interpreting it as divine warning of great calamity to come. Many in the city shared this belief, convinced that God was angered by the Idumeans' decision to take up arms against his holy city. But the storm also weakened Jerusalem's defenders. Many of the guards along the walls abandoned their posts to seek shelter, leaving portions of the city exposed. Seizing the opportunity, a group of zealots crossed the temple courts, broke through the gates, and reached the walls near the Idumean camp. Mistaking them at first for enemy troops, the Idumeans soon realized the truth and rushed into the city through the opened gates. Once inside, they immediately freed the zealots imprisoned by Ananus's men and stormed the temple complex. In the chaos that followed, thousands were slaughtered, though Josephus's estimate of 8,500 dead is likely exaggerated. The Idumeans and zealots then spread through the city, looting homes and killing anyone they suspected of loyalty to the old leadership. Their primary targets were the high priests and aristocrats. Ananus himself was among the first to die, along with his ally Jesus ben Gamaliel. The aristocratic government of Jerusalem collapsed in a single night. Those nobles who survived were thrown into prison, and the zealots held sham trials to justify their violence. In one infamous case, the wealthy Zachariah ben Baruch was accused of treason before a council of 70. Though found innocent, he was murdered on the spot by zealot assassins as they mocked the verdict, declaring that their blade delivered the true judgment. Still, despite Josephus's grim portrayal, the number of executions was likely limited to a few hundred rather than thousands. With the aristocracy destroyed, the zealots consolidated their power. Across Judea, chaos spread. Villages that had once been peaceful erupted into violence as armed bands roamed freely, looting and terrorizing the countryside. What had begun as a war of liberation was now turning into lawless anarchy. Josephus described how these local militias began to organize themselves into semi-military groups, operating in every region and claiming to fight for the revolution. In the southern desert, one group seized the fortress of Masada, an old stronghold built by Herod the Great as both a palace and a refuge against revolt. Perched high above the Dead Sea, surrounded by massive walls and stocked with cisterns and storerooms, Masada was virtually impregnable. The rebels who occupied it were known as the Sicarii, dagger men, for the short blades they used to assassinate enemies. For a time, they confined their raids to nearby settlements, gathering supplies and new recruits. When news of the chaos in Jerusalem reached them, they began to attack nearby villages such as En-Gedi, killing defenders and looting provisions. Although Josephus depicts them as violent criminals, their actions were likely aimed at seizing the lands and resources of the aristocrats rather than terrorizing fellow Jews. The countryside was now engulfed in open rebellion. Peasant militias and radical religious sects fortified caves and strongholds across Judea, Masada, Herodium, and Machaerus among them, transforming them into centers of resistance. These movements drew strength from apocalyptic beliefs, seeing the war as part of a divine struggle between good and evil. Power in Jerusalem now rested in the hands of three men: Eleazar the Zealot, John of Gischala, and Simon the Idumean. The Zealots, though deeply committed, were few, around 2,400 in number, some of them priests. John commanded the largest following, about 6,000 men from Galilee and newly arrived fighters from other militias. For a time, he was the dominant figure in the city, but ambition soon divided the revolutionaries. John's lust for power alienated many, and factions began to form within his own ranks. Rivalries among the rebel leaders grew sharper, each group looting and extorting the population under the guise of defending the faith. The Idumeans, initially summoned as allies, remained a formidable presence, numbering around 5,000 men led by Jacob ben Sosas and Simon ben Cathas. By the year 70, Jerusalem was a city torn apart by internal war, its defenders turning their swords not against Rome, but against each other, even as the legions of Vespasian and Titus closed in for the final siege. In the villages of Idumea and southern Judea, a fresh wave of rebellion was gathering strength under the leadership of Simon ben Giora. Unlike Eleazar, who led a religious sect expecting divine deliverance, Simon represented a social revolution, a movement driven by the will of the common people and fueled by the hope of freedom for the oppressed. Josephus describes Simon as a young and intelligent leader, charismatic and commanding deep respect from his followers. Originally from the region of Acrabatene in northeastern Judea, Simon had first risen to prominence during the early stages of the revolt. In the year 66, he fought in the campaign against the Roman governor Cestius Gallus, But despite his courage, the ruling government in Jerusalem, led by Ananus, mistrusted him. Considered too independent and radical, he was expelled from his home region and sought refuge in Idumea. There, Simon began to gather exiles, outlaws, and refugees, forming an army that would soon grow into one of the most formidable forces in Judea. Although he briefly allied himself with the zealots stationed at Masada, he preferred to build his own movement based on peasant resistance and the promise of liberation. The downfall of Ananus's government in Jerusalem opened the way for Simon's rise. As the Romans temporarily withdrew from the region in 68, he reclaimed the territory of his earlier command and successfully defended it against zealot incursions. He then turned his attention to Idumea, where he faced local resistance, but eventually prevailed through betrayal. According to Josephus, an Idumean officer named James secretly defected to Simon, promising to deliver key fortresses in exchange for political favor. With this act of treachery, Idumea fell into Simon's hands, and his army swelled with new recruits from among both peasants and defectors from rival factions. At his newly fortified base in Nain, Simon established what was effectively an independent revolutionary state. He declared the emancipation of slaves, the cancellation of debts, and the redistribution of land, policies that echoed the ancient Jewish Jubilee. These reforms made him immensely popular among the lower classes and gave his movement the character of a genuine peasant uprising. By Josephus's estimation, Simon commanded between 20,000 and 40,000 men and built a network of fortresses and supply depots, showing that his movement was highly organized and militarily capable. In the spring of 69, Simon advanced toward Jerusalem. By that time, John of Gischala and the Zealots had entrenched themselves within the city and ruled through intimidation. Simon's forces clashed with them outside the walls, defeating the Zealot army and driving them back into Jerusalem. During the chaos, the Zealots captured Simon's wife, but his threat of brutal retaliation compelled them to return her unharmed. While Simon was consolidating his strength near the capital, he faced renewed opposition in Idumea, where conservative landowners attempted to resist his reforms. The ensuing battles were intense, but betrayal within their ranks doomed the Idumean defenders, allowing Simon to crush the resistance and secure control over the south. Now the most powerful leader in Judea, Simon marched on Jerusalem. Inside the city, political instability reigned. The Idumean militia stationed there had turned against the radicals and allied themselves with the surviving priestly elite, launching attacks on the Zealots and Galilean factions. Fighting raged through the streets until the Zealots were forced to retreat to the temple complex and the royal palace on the Ophel Hill. When Simon's army reached the city, the Idumeans, disillusioned with their previous leaders, opened the gates to him. Once inside, Simon seized control of much of Jerusalem and immediately began driving the Zealots from their strongholds. The internal divisions deepened, creating three rival factions within the city. Eleazar ben Simon and his followers, numbering about 2,400, held the inner temple courts. John of Gischala, commanding around 6,000 men, controlled the outer courts and sections of the lower city. Simon, with approximately 15,000 soldiers, dominated the upper city and most of the remaining districts. Instead of uniting against the Romans, these three forces turned their weapons on one another. As the Roman historian Tacitus later observed, 3 leaders and 3 armies fought for mastery of Jerusalem until the approach of the Romans forced them into uneasy unity. The fighting within the city was catastrophic. Granaries and food stores were destroyed, including massive reserves of grain, an especially devastating loss if, as believed, the year 68 to 69 was a sabbatical year when farming was restricted. By the time the Romans began their siege in 70, famine had already weakened the city's defenders, leaving them desperate and disorganized. Simon's rule over Jerusalem, established in the spring of 69, was marked by his control of the remnants of the ruling class. He appointed officials from among the surviving nobility, such as Ananus ben Bagadatus, who oversaw the execution of Roman sympathizers during the siege. Meanwhile, the fragile alliance between John and Eleazar collapsed. Eleazar, fearing John's growing dominance, sought an agreement with Simon's faction, but before any union could form, John outmaneuvered him. Through deceit, he seized the inner temple, forcing Eleazar and his men to accept his leadership for the remainder of the war. Despite their divisions, the rebels remained confident of victory. The Jewish state continued to function as if permanent independence had been achieved. Coins were minted bearing inscriptions celebrating the freedom of Zion and the holiness of Jerusalem, tangible proof that the rebels believed their cause divinely sanctioned. Religious life within the city continued. The temple services were still performed, and pilgrims came from across Judea, even as Roman forces drew near to celebrate the festivals. Many were trapped when the siege finally began. The Romans, for their part, employed fear as a weapon, devastating surrounding towns to break the will of Jerusalem's defenders. Yet the rebels mistook Rome's hesitation for weakness. After Nero's death, Vespasian's political position had become uncertain, and while he waited to secure imperial power, his legions temporarily halted their advance. To the Jews, this delay seemed like divine favor, a sign that Rome was faltering. But as Josephus later observed, Vespasian's pause was strategic. He intended to let the internal strife within Jerusalem destroy its defenders from within. In the end, the Jewish civil war inside Jerusalem proved far more destructive than any Roman assault. Instead of uniting to defend their city, the rebels wasted their strength in bitter rivalries, leaving the capital weakened and divided. As chaos consumed Judea, the wider Roman world was also in turmoil. The year 69 saw uprisings across the empire, from Pontus and Britain to the Rhine, while civil war raged in Rome itself. Amid this storm, the fate of Jerusalem hung in the balance, awaiting the inevitable return of the Roman legions that would end the rebellion once and for all. AD 69 was a convulsive year for Rome, and that turmoil is the main reason the Judean campaign paused. By early 68, the siege of Jerusalem had seemed close, so Vespasian's decision to pull back toward the coast looked puzzling if judged purely on military grounds. Rebel-held territory had shrunk to a handful of desert fortresses, Machaerus, Masada, and Herodium, that could have been mopped up after the capital fell. The real driver was political. The empire was sliding toward civil war. The crisis had been building since the collapse of Seneca's influence in 62. Forced into retirement and stripped of wealth, the philosopher-statesman died by his own hand after the Piso conspiracy unraveled in 65. Nero then ruled with a tight inner circle, his wife Poppaea Sabina and the Praetorian prefect Tigellinus, while his spending and paranoia rattled Rome's elite. Confiscations, prosecutions, and a climate of denunciation fueled fear, and the treasury was drained to indulge the emperor's extravagance. Unrest flickered across the provinces through the 60s, with the Jewish revolt the most alarming. On the Rhine, auxiliary troops mutinied and teamed up with Gallic leaders and Druids, briefly sketching the outline of a breakaway Gallic realm. At home, the failed plot of 65 unleashed a wave of forced suicides among senators, officers, and intellectuals. Then came a fatal misstep. Nero executed 3 of Rome's most respected commanders, Rufus, Proculus, and Corbulo, convincing many in the ruling class that no one was safe. In 68, events raced ahead. Summoned back from Greece by his freedman Helios, who sensed trouble, Nero returned to face a revolt led by Julius Vindex, governor of Lugdunensis. Vindex denounced Nero and courted Servius Sulpicius Galba, the seasoned governor of Hispania, to front a movement that mixed high politics with local grievances. Nero counted on the Rhine legions under Virginius Rufus and Fonteius Capito, while Galba had only a single legion and needed allies. Vindex forced the issue by hailing Galba as emperor. Galba accepted and soon drew support from neighboring Spanish governors, including Otho, Poppaea's former husband. Nero's position weakened, but Vindex was defeated when negotiations with Rufus collapsed into battle. Vindex took his own life, and Galba seemed finished, until Rome itself turned. Grain prices spiked, confidence evaporated, and the Praetorian prefect Sabinus judged that Nero was doomed. He bought the guards' loyalty for Galba. The Senate declared Nero an enemy, and the court scattered. Nero fled the city with a handful of companions and ended his life outside Rome. With Nero gone, Galba entered the city in strength, but his harsh discipline, purges, and tin-eared politics quickly burned through goodwill. Galba shifted provincial commands, sending Vitellius to Lower Germany and Flaccus to Upper Germany, left much of Nero's apparatus intact, and slighted former backers. He crushed a legion of fleet recruits that Nero had raised, then decimated them, and failed to reward Otho or Caecina. Power clustered around 3 court figures, Vinius, Laco, and Aetzelus, alienating many others. On the first day of 69, the German legions refused the traditional oath and proclaimed Vitellius. In Rome, the Praetorians were already restive as Otho courted them with cash. Galba tried to steady things by adopting the young noble Picio Licinianus as heir, but he refused the donative the troops expected. Discontent boiled over. On the 15th of January, Otho launched a coup. Galba's side could not muster enough men. Rumors of Otho's death briefly buoyed them, but the guard arrived in force and cut Galba down in the Forum. The new ruler moved quickly to consolidate. He wrapped himself in Nero's lingering popularity among the urban masses, flirted with styling himself Nero Otho, restored statues and portraits, brought back Nero's freedmen and procurators, and resumed work on the Golden House. He amnestied many of Galba's supporters, even rewarding men who had opposed him, and placed potential rivals in posts that would tie them to his regime, including naming Vespasian's brother Sabinus as city prefect and advancing Virginius Rufus for the consulship. He also ordered confiscated properties returned to those ruined under Nero, despite the strained finances. None of this reconciled the Rhine armies. Vitellius still had the weight of Germany behind him, so Otho had to prepare for war even as he shored up Italy and the capital. With the empire tearing itself apart, Vespasian held his legions in Judea, waiting to see who would rule in Rome, and when to strike Jerusalem for maximum advantage. Otho managed to assemble a sizable force in Italy, and had the Danubian legions reached him in time, they might have swung the war his way. On New Year's Day, the troops of Lower Germany refused their loyalty to Galba, yet stopped short of proclaiming Vitellius. The next day, Fabius Valens hailed Vitellius as emperor, and by the 3rd, the legions of Upper Germany had mutinied as well. Vitellius began organizing in earnest. His generals, Caecina and Volans pushed into Italy in two separate columns. After mixed results, they delivered a decisive victory at Bedriacum. Seeing more bloodshed ahead, Otho ended the crisis himself by taking his own life after a reign of barely 3 months. Even hostile writers admitted the manner of his death stunned the army, and some soldiers reportedly killed themselves at his pyre, calling him the bravest and best of rulers. Vitellius's slow advance from Germany bled communities along the way. He entered major towns as if in triumph, crossed rivers on garlanded barges, and demanded lavish fare at every stop. Ancient historians also jabbed at his gluttony. Once in Italy, discipline frayed. His men brawled with locals, freed slaves at whim, beat and even murdered those who objected. When he toured a battlefield strewn with Roman dead, he quipped that the corpse of a fellow citizen smelled worse than an enemy's, then took a long drink and passed the cup. The elite greeted his approach uneasily. Otho had tried to reconcile factions. Vitellius's lieutenants had used terror, and he had not reined them in. With Otho gone, there was no obvious rival to rally behind, so Sabinus administered the oath in Rome, and the eastern armies followed. Vitellius hesitated to adopt the titles Caesar and Augustus, though he took on their powers. He replaced palace freedmen with equestrians to appease the aristocracy. He courted Nero's admirers with public rites and extravagant shows, even pressing Nero's former favorite, Sporus, toward a humiliating performance that Sporus avoided by ending his life. His real weakness was military. He had not crushed Otho decisively, the eastern legions were uneasy, and his purge of Otho's praetorians and the executions of Danubian centurions alienated more officers and men. To feel secure, he kept a heavy garrison in Rome, many of them Germans. At the same time, a Batavian revolt under Julius Civilis flared, blocking reinforcements from the Rhine. The east then moved. On the 1st of July, the Egyptian prefect Julius Tiberius Alexander swore his troops to Vespasian. Judea and Syria quickly followed. The Flavian plan took shape. Mucianus marched west with Syrian forces, while Vespasian went to secure Alexandria and the grain supply. Before Mucianus could arrive, the Danubian legions under Antonius Primus crossed into Italy on their own initiative. Caecina defected to the Flavians, but failed to bring his army with him. The rival camps met near Cremona and fought through the night. Vitellius's lines broke, their camp fell, and Cremona was sacked. Primus dragged his looting soldiers away and drove on Rome. Skirmishes followed, but the Flavian advantage grew and defections multiplied. In Rome, Vitellius opened talks with Sabinus, Vespasian's brother, and briefly abdicated, walking into the forum as a private man. Momentum shifted again. His supporters dragged him back to the palace, and the Flavian party seized the Capitoline. Fighting there burned down the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the city's holiest shrine. Sabinus was captured and executed, while Domitian escaped in disguise and hid with a family friend. The Flavian legions forced their way into the capital. Vitellian troops fought street by street, but the Praetorian camp fell. Vitellius fled and was found and killed after being paraded past toppled statues and the site where Galba had died. His final retort to an officer who mocked him was a reminder that he had been their emperor. Then he was cut down and his body abused by the same crowd that had once flattered him. Vitellius had inspired fierce loyalty among the German legions and, to a degree, among the urban masses. But like Galba and Otho, he never resolved Rome's deeper fractures or secured broad military legitimacy. Vespasian stood in a different position. With the eastern legions united behind him, the Rhine tied down by revolt, and able lieutenants in Titus and Mucianus, plus experienced commanders who had served Otho, his path to power was clear. When Nero died and Galba took power, Vespasian had sent Titus with King Agrippa to pay respects and receive fresh orders for the Judean war. News of Galba's murder turned them back to Caesarea, where Vespasian and his generals waited to see who would prevail. After Vitellius triumphed, rumors spread that he planned to swap eastern and western legions, shunting the comfortable eastern troops to the cold Rhine forts. Whether true or not, the talk hardened the East against him and set the stage for the Flavian move that would end the chaos in Rome, and, soon after, bring the siege of Jerusalem back to the top of the agenda. Josephus paints a clear picture of the talk running through Vespasian's camp. Around campfires and in mess tents, officers and rank and file alike grumbled that pampered troops in the capital were picking emperors for profit, while the men who actually fought Rome's wars were surrendering their rights. They argued that their own commander was far more deserving than Vitellius, and that no one had earned the purple more than Vespasian. He also suggests Vespasian did not leap at the chance. The general valued the safety of private life and knew how perilous the throne could be. But his officers pressed harder, and the soldiers made it plain, swords in hand, that refusal was not an option. After setting out his reasons for declining and failing to sway them, he accepted their acclamation. Momentum in the east made a takeover unavoidable. The Egyptian prefect, Tiberius Julius Alexander, declared for Vespasian, delivering both the Nile garrison and control of the grain lifeline to Rome. Support soon followed from Mucianus, governor of Syria, and from the Danubian legions whose rising was led by Antonius Primus, with the eastern provinces and the Balkans behind him. Two of the empire's three great military blocs, Vespasian now held the advantage. Rather than march straight west, he moved first to Antioch to stabilize Syria, then shifted his headquarters to Alexandria and shut off Rome's grain. He dispatched Mucianus with roughly 20,000 men to Asia to rally further backing. It was a risky play that could have given Vitellius time to recover, but Primus cut the knot, drove his Danubian troops across the Alps into the Po Valley, and struck before the enemy regrouped. At Cremona, for the second time that year, the Flavian side prevailed. With Vitellius overthrown, senior officers set up a provisional administration in Rome under Vespasian's younger son, Domitian. The empire now had a new ruler, exactly as Josephus had foretold. Word of the victory reached Vespasian and Titus only at year's end. Vespasian remained in Alexandria through the early months of 70, and then sailed for Rome. Before departing, he handed command in Judea to Titus, with explicit orders to take Jerusalem and end the war by summer. Titus now led the largest field army in the Roman world, and the stability of the Flavian regime depended on a swift, emphatic success. His drive during the siege of Jerusalem, his urgency, and his willingness to accept losses to break the city grew out of that political necessity. Without the need to legitimize a new dynasty, Roman operations in Judea might have dragged on as sluggishly as the campaigns against Civilis on the Rhine. The stage was set. The final struggle for Jerusalem was about to begin, and for many Jews it felt like the long-expected end of days was arriving in fire and blood. Before any assault on Jerusalem, Rome first had to strip Simon son of Giora of the ground he held in the northeast of Judea and across Idumea, then post garrisons there. Once that belt was secured, only 3 royal fortresses, Herodium, Masada, and Machaerus, remained, along with a few cave hideouts above the Dead Sea. Vespasian judged these last pockets militarily negligible and left them for later. Operations paused in early July of 69 when the Eastern legions hailed Vespasian as emperor. He and Titus convened a war council at Berytus, where Josephus was finally taken out of irons as a reward for the prophecy the Flavians believed he had fulfilled, and enrolled as a useful advisor and go-between. Father and son then moved to Egypt to lock down the grain supply. Only in the spring of 70 did the Judean campaign restart. Vespasian transferred command in the province to Titus and sailed for Rome to claim the throne that now seemed within reach. In early spring, Titus marched out from the Nile Delta along the North Sinai and up the coast past Gaza, Ascalon, Jamnia, and Joppa, concentrating the army at Caesarea before turning inland. 4 legions formed the corps: V. Macedonica, X. Fretensis, 15th Apollinaris, and the 12th Fulminata brought down from Syria, augmented by 2,000 men from the Egyptian 3rd Cyrenaica and 22nd Deioteriana. The auxiliary formations remained as the field, and the client kings swelled the total. Agrippa and Sohaemus led their own contingents in person. Contemporary writers add that Arab levies joined out of long-standing hostility to their neighbors, and a sprinkling of Roman and Italian fortune-seekers tagged along to win. Tiberius Julius Alexander, the Egyptian prefect who had first declared for Vespasian, now served on Titus's staff, as did the new procurator of Judea, Mu Antonius Julianus. Josephus marched with them as cultural advisor, interpreter, and envoy. He records the April advance in classic Roman order: royal and allied troops out front, road clearers and camp builders next, the officers' baggage, then the commander with his picked guard and the legionary cavalry. Behind them, the siege engines, staff officers with escorts, and the eagles with their standards and trumpeters. A dense column of legionaries, 6 abreast, the legion's servants and baggage, and finally the mercenaries with a rear guard to keep them in line. 2 legions lagged a few miles to the rear near the village of Gabath Saul. Because supply in the hill country was vulnerable to ambush, Titus sent the V toward Emmaus and the X toward Jericho to secure approaches. At dawn, on the 23rd of April, a strong cavalry screen, over 500 riders led by Titus himself, appeared on the ridges north of Jerusalem to reconnoiter. Jerusalem's site had been a fortress since the days of David. By the 1st century, it sprawled across 2 spurs. To the east rose Temple Mount with the Ophel just south of it, and the Antonia fortress locking onto the northwest corner of the enclosure. The western spur was broader, higher, and ran out to Mount Zion. There, during Hasmonean and Herodian times, the elite upper city had grown up, with Herod's palace anchoring the northwest. Between the ridges lay the Tyropoeon Valley, while deep ravines, Hinnom to west and south, Kidron to the east, guarded 3 sides. An older circuit, the first wall, wrapped the upper and lower cities, but expansions to the south and north had added 2 more rings. The second wall ran roughly from the Antonia westward to the Geneth Gate near the palace. Farther out, the third wall enclosed the new city on Bezetha Hill. Agrippa the Throne had begun that northern rampart with massive ashlars, then halted the job under Roman pressure. The rebels later finished and heightened it to about 9 meters at the parapet and studded it with projecting square towers. From the northern heights, Titus could take in the whole defensive system. He posted X. Fretensis on the Mount of Olives to command the eastern approaches and camped the other 3 legions on Mount Scopus. Then, riding down from Scopus toward the main gate in the third wall, he swung right toward the Cephanus Tower at the northwest corner. It was an audacious move. He had little immediate support. The ground broke steeply in places, and gardens, ditches, low walls, and olive groves made poor going for horses. The Roman approach finally welded the rebel factions into a single war effort. The terrain and city fabric favored them. Narrow lanes, blind alleys, and a honeycomb of water and sewer tunnels let fighters appear and vanish at will. They organized into nimble bands of a few hundred, unburdened by heavy armor, and hit hard with slings, javelins, and stones, switching to swords, daggers, and spears once the fight closed. For such ground, theirs was the better style of war. Soon after Titus left the road, a small Jewish detachment rushed him and sliced his column in two. The troops still on the roadway bolted, which left Titus and the forward party stranded among orchards and garden walls. Under a storm of missiles, he hacked a path out, remarkably without a scratch. Josephus notes that Titus had ridden out to scout rather than to fight, and wore neither helmet nor cuirass. Buoyed by this opening success, the defenders took heart and began to believe fortune was on their side. By the following day, the rest of the army had closed up, and work began at once on 3 fortified camps. The 12th and 15th Legions set theirs on Mount Scopus, northeast of the city. A little to the rear, the 5th established another base. Across the Kidron on the far slope, the 10th entrenched on the Mount of Olives. From the walls, Jewish commanders could watch the layout take shape. Simon, son of Giora, who held the third wall, had launched the first blow. Now, as the Romans dug and palisaded, the factions inside Jerusalem set their quarrels aside to strike a combined blow at the 10th. The sortie burst from the eastern and southern gates, swept across the Kidron, stormed the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, and crashed into legionaries still spading trenches and pitching tents. The surprise shattered the work parties. Some Romans dropped tools and ran. Others scrambled for weapons and fell before they could form ranks. Reinforcements poured out of the gates, and, with momentum behind them, looked more numerous than they were. Soldiers trained for ordered formations often falter when ambushed by loose, fast-moving fighters. The Romans broke, and the camp was briefly lost. Titus hauled in men from Scopus, steadied the line, and drove the attackers back into the valley. The rebels reformed against the western bank under the cover of their walls, where a Roman uphill charge would be punished by missiles from above. The two sides glared at each other until midday. Then Titus thinned his front to send details back up the ridge to resume the earthworks. Lookouts on the ramparts flashed signals. A fresh wave surged from the gates and clambered up the slope. The Romans on the ridge panicked and ran. Camp laborers followed at the first sight of the oncoming mass. With only a handful around him, Titus was in real danger. Officers on the crest rallied cohorts for a counterstroke, pounded downhill, and again forced the rebels across the stream. This time Titus kept a solid screen in place while the engineers returned to work, and from then on, strong pickets of horse and foot guarded every shovel and stake. During the lull, the old feuds inside the city flared. It was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Eleazar ordered the gates opened to worshippers. John used the moment. His men hid weapons under plain garments and slipped in among the pilgrims. Once inside, they cast off their cloaks and seized positions. Panic gripped the courts as visitors fled for cover, and the zealots, unwilling to grapple at that instant, slipped into the vaults. Private grudges erupted under the smoke of faction labels, and enemies settled scores under the pretense of politics. John broke Eleazar's power and forced a bargain. Eleazar submitted to John's leadership against the two external foes, Rome and Simon. 3 rival camps had become 2. For the Romans, the ground itself was the next enemy. Between the camps and the walls, hedges, trees, fences, and field walls had to go. Ditches had to be filled, boulders prized out, and slopes smoothed to rob the defenders of cover and springboard for sudden rushes. The defenders tried a new trick along the northern face of the third wall, a knot of men huddled at the base, feigning terror. Voices on the parapets called for peace and promised to open the gates, while pelting the group below with stones to sell the illusion of a purge. Hidden just behind the curtain of masonry stood a strike party, waiting to hit any Romans who took the bait. Titus suspected a trap, but many of his soldiers did not. They dashed for the gate, and were met by a storm of missiles from front and crown, then by a sudden flanking charge from the hidden force. After brutal wrestling at close quarters, the Romans broke away and fell back to their lines. Titus rebuked them for abandoning formation without orders. Once again, he had to reckon with the defenders' craft and agility. With the approaches cleared and negotiations going nowhere, the reality hardened. A direct blow at the first wall from the ravines of the Kidron or Hinnom was impossible. The north was the only feasible front, where the ground lay more even. The third wall was stout along most of its length, yet the new northern quarter had weak spots. Titus prepared to drive at the second and third walls from that side, raising ramps and bringing up the rams, determined to finish quickly for the sake of the new regime in Rome. Josephus went out again and again to plead for surrender, and was showered with curses and stones. Inside the city, confidence and desperation mingled. Outside it, the siege engines creaked forward. Titus identified a vulnerable stretch of the northern defenses near the Cephanus Tower and the western gate, then shifted his dispositions. The 10th Legion stayed on the Mount of Olives, while the other legions moved to 2 fresh camps roughly a quarter-mile from the walls, the 5th facing the western gate and the 12th and 15th opposite Cephanus. To bring up the baggage in safety, he threw a protective line of troops across the northwest approaches to smother hit-and-run raids from the city. Immediately afterward, the army set to work on 3 earthen and timber ramparts. Screened by wicker mantelets, with archers and artillery pushing close to suppress the parapets, the ramps climbed steadily despite a few sharp sallies from Simon, son of Giora's fighters. Once the distance closed, Titus ordered the engines forward. The heavy rams rumbled up the new roadways under a hail of covering fire, and at his signal, the pounding began. The crash of wood on stone rolled along the northern front, and the shock echoed through the city. The factions inside scrambled to the same battlements and hurled missiles in concert. The fiercest defenders clambered onto the ram roofs, tore at the mantlets, and showered the crews with stones and darts. Firebrands arced down toward the machines. When a lull fell, a strike force burst from the western gate and hit the works from an unexpected angle, driving deep among the engines with torches. Some legionaries stood firm. Titus spurred in with cavalry, slammed the sortie back to the gate, and prevented serious damage. A handful of rebels fell, and 1 prisoner was taken. Titus crucified him before the walls as a warning. Soon after, an Idumean commander named John, speaking casually in the ranks, was picked off by an Arab archer, a loss that shook the defenders. A week of hammering told. Towering, ironclad siege turrets rose more than 20 meters high on each ramp, too massive to tip and armored against flame. The largest ram, nicknamed Victor, finally cracked the third wall on 7th May. The garrison fell back to the second wall. Roman cohorts surged through the breach, opened the gates, leveled a section of the outer curtain, and occupied the new city's northwest quarter, where they raised a new camp in the area known as the Camp of the Assyrians. Titus pressed on. Within 4 days, a second ram knocked out the middle tower of the second wall's north face and opened a path for more than 1,000 legionaries to push into the suburb. He cautioned his men against plundering and once more held out terms. Then he left a small force to hold the captured towers and guard the breach. Hidden fighters slipped out from nearby gates, seeped through alleys, and encircled the outpost. Missiles rained from roofs and doorways. The Romans locked shields and fought back to the rubble gap, only to be pinned there under a storm of projectiles. The guard on the second wall broke and ran. Rebels swarmed to the breach, which was so narrow that only a few legionaries could squeeze through at a time. An emergency screen of archers laid down covering fire and pulled them out. The defenders reclaimed the wall and barricaded the opening for 3 days. On the 4th, the legions battered their way in again. This time, Titus tore down the entire northern stretch of the second wall and manned the remaining towers with stronger garrisons. Nearly 2 weeks of brutal street-to-wall fighting followed. Titus then called a 4-day pause, hoping the defenders would reconsider. It also happened to be payday. He had the legions formed up in full kit and issued their stipends in the open, a display of mail, standards, caparisoned horses, and polished metal that glittered across the northern plain and sent a deliberate message. Josephus went forward once more to urge surrender, appealing to spare city and sanctuary. He was met with curses and missiles. The line now stabilized. John's coalition with the Zealots held the temple platform and the Antonia to the east. The temple terrace towered roughly 45 meters above the surrounding ground, ringed by a high colonnade with defenders massed along the north and west. The Antonia connected to those porticos by stairways, giving rapid access to the courts below. Simon's army held the first wall from north to the royal palace. At the northwest corner, 3 colossal marble towers rose around 40 meters high, crowned with battlements. The northern front stretched about 1,200 meters and was packed so thickly that roughly 20 men stood for every meter. Confidence among the defenders was high. Titus aimed at the hinge of the whole position, the Antonia. He split his forces, sending the 5th and 12th against the fortress, while the 10th and 15th drove on the first wall. New ramps went up in pairs against the Antonia, spaced close together and in broader fronts against the city curtain. Despite continuous harassment from the parapets, the work reached completion by 29th May. The rebels had prepared a counterstroke. John's men tunneled from chambers beneath the temple pavement, drove a gallery under the Roman approach, and propped it with timbers. When the rams nosed into place, they fired the pit with pitch and bitumen. The supports burned through, the gallery roof collapsed, and the Roman embankment sagged and then thundered down. Smoke and dust spouted from the crater before flames burst clear. The legions reeled at the loss, so near to what had looked like the final push. 3 days later, Simon answered in kind on the western front. He sent out a trio of daredevils, Tephthaeus of Galilee, Megacerus, once a royal retainer, and Seageras of Adiabene, lame but fearless. They sprinted straight through the Roman screens as if racing to friends rather than into an army, reached the engines, and set them ablaze while taking blows from every side. Reinforcements poured in on both sides. The fires took hold and roared through the rams and the timbered roadways. Flushed with success, The rebels surged beyond the gates and pressed the legions through the northern streets toward their camp. The camp guard, under orders to hold at any cost, dragged bolt throwers onto the ramparts and blasted the attackers to a halt. Titus arrived, swung a counterattack onto the rebel right, and stemmed the rout. Choked by dust and heat, the defenders finally withdrew behind the first wall. In 2 days, they had undone work that had taken the Romans more than 2 weeks to build. The Roman setback shook morale. They had already stripped the hills bare of timber, and even if new wood could be hauled in for more ramps, nothing guaranteed the rebels would not burn them again. Titus gathered his commanders. A headlong assault by the whole army was urged by some, a starvation blockade by others. Neither plan was practical in full. The only workable path was to rebuild the works and choke the city with pressure and fear. Titus ordered a continuous ring of fortifications thrown around Jerusalem. The line ran nearly 5 miles, about 8 kilometers, starting and ending on Bezetha. Josephus claims it rose in 3 days and was anchored by 13 strong points, likely held by allied auxiliaries. The cordon bit immediately. Pilgrims who had come for unleavened bread had already swollen the population, perhaps to 250,000. All of them needed food. Supplies could come from the temple storehouses, set aside for tithes and first fruits, from rebel grain reserves laid in before the siege, from private stocks held by wealthy families and merchants, by smuggling through the lines, and by short-range foraging outside the walls. The Romans now set out to strangle foraging and smuggling, and to force the defenders to burn through whatever lay inside. The seal was not perfect. Aristocratic families slipped out and were received in the Roman camp as future allies. Ordinary fugitives fared far worse. Many who were caught were tortured or crucified in view of the walls, a sickening forest of crosses meant to break the city's will. Hunger took hold. Josephus tells a ghastly tale of a mother who cooked her infant and shared it with a foraging party. Whether or not every detail is true, the famine produced horrors. At first, the authorities paid to bury the dead. As bodies multiplied and strength failed, corpses were tipped over the walls or dumped at the gates, feeding disease that spread through the quarters faster than any fire. Starvation and plague fueled fresh quarrels and desertions. Simon responded with terror to halt defections. He arrested the high priest Matthias, the same man who had first welcomed him into the city, along with Matthias's 3 sons. All 4 were executed, and the bodies denied burial. 2 more priests, Ananias and Aristeas, and 15 nobles followed them to the scaffold. When an officer of Simon's garrison tried to defect with 10 men, he and his group were put to death as well. The message worked. The peace party ceased to matter. For a month, the Romans focused on machines. Titus counted on famine, disease, crucifixions, and relentless summonses to surrender to grind down resistance, while his own troops, well-fed, flaunted their rations to taunt the city. Yet experience told him the final push would be brutal. He poured effort into the Antonia. Crews ranged across Judea, felling every tree within reach, until the landscape looked dead. With fresh timber, the legions raised 4 new platforms in 21 days. When the earthworks stood ready, both armies felt the strain. The rebels knew that if they failed to burn these ramps, the city would likely fall. The Romans feared that if they lost them again, they might never take Jerusalem at all. Timber was scarce. Soldiers reeked from unending toil, and confidence sagged after repeated reverses. Worse, the defenders' nerve seemed unbreakable. They had endured factional war, famine, siege, and still came out fighting. Roman officers tightened security on the works and braced for the next exchange. 10 weeks had passed since the siege began. Though weakened, the rebels struck first. John's men in the Antonia surged out with torches but wavered and faltered before they reached the ramps, a half-hearted rush that collapsed against a bristling wall of shields. They fell back, and the legions advanced the rams again, crews hammered all day, prying at the base with crowbars. Only 4 stones shifted under a rain of rocks and firebrands from above. Then the weight and pounding triggered an unseen weakness. The tunnel that John's sappers had driven weeks earlier gave way, and the entire northern face of the Antonia crashed down. Both sides reeled. John had prepared for this moment. Behind the fallen curtain, he had thrown up a rough inner wall with a slope of rubble in front, and the corner towers still commanding the approaches on either flank. A storming attempt would be a bloodbath. Titus called for volunteers and asked for the best men in the army. Only 12 stepped forward. A Syrian named Sabinus led them in a daring dash. They clambered up under a storm of missiles, scattered the first defenders, and actually gained the wall. It was madness. With no support behind them, Sabinus stumbled and went down under a hail of stones. 3 more were beaten to death. The survivors, riddled with wounds, were dragged back from the front by their comrades, leaving the improvised barrier still in rebel hands. 2 days later, in the small hours of July 5th, a hand-picked party slipped forward to try a stealth attack. 20 infantry from the ramp guards, a standard-bearer, a trumpeter, and 2 cavalrymen crept into the shattered shell of Antonia. They found the sentries asleep, cut them down, climbed the walls, and the trumpeter's blast summoned support. Startled awake, the remaining guards scattered towards the temple. Titus arrived with officers and chosen troops to secure the gain. The fugitives had rushed into the temple precincts, so the Romans followed through the passageways John's fighters had used before. John's and Simon's forces linked up and blocked the approaches, and a brutal struggle jammed the tunnel mouths for hours. Roman armor gave them the edge in close combat, but the choke points denied them numbers, while the defenders fed fresh men from the open courts behind. A Bithynian centurion named Julian, famed for his strength, smashed into the line and threw it into momentary confusion. He slipped on the polished paving, his hobnailed boots betraying him, and was mobbed. Helmet and cuirass kept him alive long enough to kill several attackers from the ground, but with no rescue coming, he was finally cut down. The push onto the temple platform had stalled. The detachment fell back, and the fighting paused. Titus ordered the remaining walls of Antonia knocked down to open a broad breach for a full-scale storming of the sanctuary. Josephus went forward yet again as spokesman, calling out in the Jewish tongue that they should spare their city, quench the flames licking at the holy place, and resume the offerings due to God. The crowd heard him in heavy silence. John spat curses and swore he could never be taken, since the city belonged to God. The plea was almost certainly delivered in Aramaic, the language of the streets. On July 17th, the Romans readied a major assault. That day the priests halted the daily sacrifice for lack of lambs, a sign many took as doom drawing near. More high priestly houses and other notable families slipped over to the Romans. The militia contingents remained resolute. Even now, the defenders still counterattacked. On the 9th of August, they rushed out from the eastern gate and slammed into the Roman line. Titus threw in cavalry, and after 3 hours, the rebels fell back to the inner courts. The next day, they struck again against the outer court. Then chance, or one soldier, turned the fight. A Roman hurled a brand through a window of a chamber on the inner court. Fire took hold at once, smoke billowed, and the defenders were split between saving the sacred precinct and beating back the advance. Roman lines surged, forced an entry, and fighting spilled into the temple itself. Josephus later wrote that Titus did not want the sanctuary destroyed and argued against an attack, though he places the general at the heart of the action. Other testimony, likely stemming from Tacitus, has Titus pressing for total destruction so that the faith of Jews and the new Christian sect would be stamped out. Whatever the intent, the flames and steel that followed made argument moot. Some scholars read Josephus's shifting tone as his effort to make sense of Flavian policy, which looked double-edged. The victors appeared determined to erase the temple cult for good, yet at the same time, they proclaimed that Jews could keep their ancestral law. Any trace of hesitation Josephus detected in Titus could be taken to mean the new regime was not uniformly hostile to Jewish tradition. Once fresh fires caught, the legions pressed on, cutting down anyone in their path. John's and Eleazar's fighters hacked their way to the southern gates and escaped across the outer court. Inside the sanctuary, the last defenders fought with whatever lay to hand. Priests ripped the bird spikes from the roof and hurled them at the attackers. Others, convinced all hope was gone, cast themselves into the flames. As the temple burned, the victors looted without restraint and butchered indiscriminately. Age and status made no difference. Children, elders, laypeople, priests, supplicants, and resistors alike were cut down. The siege had turned into a campaign of annihilation. Trapped within roughly 1 square mile, Jerusalem's people endured nearly a month at the mercy of soldiers who observed no limits and showed no mercy. Atrocities fell on fighters and civilians without distinction. Many inside clung to the belief that God would deliver them. A self-styled prophet urged the crowd to gather at the temple, promising a sign of salvation. Unarmed men, women, and children swarmed onto the roof of an outer colonnade. Legionaries saw them, fired the structure below, and the mass perished. Some jumped to their deaths. Others burned where they stood. None survived. The temple's treasure now became spoils. Beyond its sacred role, the complex served as a vault for the wealthy, housed offerings, and the temple tax, and stored tithes and other valuables dedicated by vow. Titus, who had fought at close quarters, was saluted as the standards were carried up. At the eastern gate, the troops sacrificed an ox, a sheep, and a pig, a deliberate affront to Jewish sensibilities, while they chanted the triumphal title for their commander. Resistance was not finished. Simon's forces held firm in the upper city. Survivors from John's ranks joined them. Thousands of fighters still occupied strong positions, above all the royal palace on the highest ridge. Both sides saw value in talking, and envoys met on the bridge that spanned the Tyropoion between the sanctuary's western gate and the gymnasium on the slope of the upper city. Simon and John asked to pass the Roman lines with their families and disappear into the wilderness. Titus refused and offered only slavery or death. From his point of view, freeing them would only reinforce enemies in the south. He needed Jerusalem to capitulate, and the revolt crushed beyond revival. Stung that captives presumed to dictate terms, Titus had a proclamation issued. No more desertions would be received. No terms would be granted. He would show no mercy. From that point, he said, events would be ruled by the laws of war. The next day, the fighting resumed. The Romans burned most of the lower city and cleared it of rebels within 2 days. Simon and John turned the royal palace into a fortress for those still under arms. To send a message, they staged executions. One Roman captive was killed and dragged through the streets. A second, on the brink of beheading, slipped away and reached his own lines, only to be reprimanded for being taken alive. Simon also seized 5 Idumean leaders who had tried to negotiate in secret and had them put to death. The point was clear. There would be no surrender. The struggle would be fought to the end. The palace could not be taken by ladder, so the legions went back to building. On the 20th of August, they began new earthworks in the Hinnom Valley and labored for more than 2 weeks to raise platforms against the western palace wall. Auxiliary troops threw up additional works near the bridge, the gymnasium, and Simon's Tower. Rebel missiles slowed the labor, but hunger was wearing the defenders down and their sorties lost bite. Desertions mounted. A group of aristocrats gave themselves up and were held for shipment to Rome as hostages. Other defectors faced a military inquest. Those deemed respectable were released, which often meant those with money to buy their safety. A former temple treasurer named Jesus smuggled out a cache of sacred valuables and secured his own passage. Most who fled without means were sold. All this complicates Josephus's claim that the war was the project of militant factions alone. Evidence shows many from the ruling class stayed with the cause to the very end. The 2,000 notables freed by the Idumeans in the previous year apparently chose to remain inside the city to support an independent Judea. Nothing physically barred them from leaving during the siege. Josephus's own brother and 50 companions were taken when the city fell, all seemingly men of standing and all actively engaged in the defense. On the 7th of September, the siege platforms against the palace stood ready, and the rams went to work. Parts of the wall crashed down, and legionaries poured through the breaches with little opposition. The rebel chieftains withdrew into the 3 northern towers, but soon abandoned them as well. They scattered in search of a way past the Roman cordon. Some crawled into the sewers. The rebel army dissolved into a stampede of frightened men. The uprising was finished. The sack was about to begin. The Romans, now in full control of the ramparts, planted their standards on the towers and broke into cheers, convinced the hardest part was behind them. The final barrier had fallen with astonishing ease. With no defenders left to meet them, even the victors were momentarily at a loss. What followed was brutal. Columns of soldiers surged into the lanes with drawn swords, cutting down anyone they encountered and setting houses ablaze with those sheltering inside. Bodies piled up in the streets, and blood ran through the alleys as the city was put to the sword. Jerusalem had at last been taken. Titus ordered the defensive works razed, sparing only the towers known as Hippicus, Phazel, and Mariamne, along with a short section on the western side to serve as a stronghold for the occupying force. The 5th, 12th, and 15th legions were reassigned to other eastern posts. The 10th legion, supported by auxiliaries, remained to garrison the city. Archaeology indicates that this unit stayed in Jerusalem into the early 3rd century. Imperial rule now imposed a harsh settlement. The temple would not be rebuilt. The high priesthood and the Sanhedrin were dissolved. The temple levy was redirected to the cult of Jupiter on the Capitoline, which in practice sent the revenue into Rome's coffers. Most Jewish land was claimed as imperial property, reducing many farmers to tenants of the emperor. These measures ensured that, although Jerusalem had fallen, resistance smoldered on among insurgents still operating in the deserts of southern Judea. Before departing Jerusalem for Caesarea, Titus staged a formal victory ceremony inside the Roman camp. He praised the troops, placed gold wreaths on those who had distinguished themselves, and promoted men on the spot. The legions then held their own revels, sacrificing great herds of cattle and sharing out plunder. The hoard was immense, though the choicest pieces were set aside for the triumph in Rome. Josephus also received his reward. As the city was about to fall, Titus told him to take whatever he wished. Rather than seize valuables, Josephus asked for the release of compatriots and was granted it, along with a set of sacred writings. Soon after, he secured freedom for his brother and 50 friends. In Rome, the defeated were exhibited in a lavish triumph that Josephus says he witnessed. John of Gischala and Simon bar Giora marched in chains while towering pageant carts rolled past, stacked with scenes of the war. Fertile fields laid waste, troops cut down, fugitives chased or bound, engines battering colossal walls, strongholds stormed, streets running red, supplicants begging for mercy, temples blazing, houses collapsing, and broad rivers mirrored by a countryside still burning. Treasures from the temple and other precious ornaments were paraded as trophies. 700 exceptionally tall prisoners, dressed in ornate costumes, had been selected months earlier for the spectacle. Others had met swift death. Those branded as terrorists were executed. Many were dispatched to the mines and quarries of Egypt, and large numbers of survivors were sent to die in the arena. John was sentenced to life in prison. Simon tried to escape by tunneling out of the city. When that failed, he emerged amid the ruins wearing a short white tunic and a crimson cloak, hoping to unnerve the Romans. He was seized, chained, and delivered to Titus at Caesarea. In the triumph's final act at the Capitol, Simon was dragged across the Forum, scourged until his flesh was torn, and strangled at the public execution site. Crowds roared their approval, sacrifices followed, and the city feasted in celebration of victory. Modern readers often note Josephus's cool tone as he describes the temple's spoils and Rome's pageantry. Rather than lament, he dwells on the artifacts and their new resting place, even recounting how Vespasian later displayed renowned wonders in the Temple of Peace and kept the law and purple hangings in the palace. Some have argued that by dwelling on these objects, Josephus invites his audience to measure the temple's grandeur against Rome's monuments, subtly turning his narrative into a statement with political bite, even after the sanctuary lay in ashes. After Jerusalem's fall, resistance did not vanish. Fighters who slipped the net drifted south and east, where guerrilla bands already operated. One new concentration formed in the so-called Forest of Jardès, whose precise location is unknown. 3 desert strongholds also remained in rebel hands: Herodium, Machaerus, and Masada. The Romans set about reducing them methodically, radiating out from Jerusalem. Herodium, a cone-shaped citadel about 10 miles south of the city, was first. Built by Herod with a summit palace, ring wall, and 4 towers, it held ample storerooms and rock-cut cisterns. Yet the defenders yielded quickly, for reasons our sources do not spell out, and the fortress passed to Rome with little effort. Command then fell to Lucilius Bassus, newly appointed governor, a veteran of the civil wars and former prefect of the fleets at Misenum and Ravenna, accompanied by the procurator Liberius Maximus. Bassus crossed the Jordan to besiege Machaerus, a flat-topped height east of the Dead Sea, originally fortified by the Hasmoneans and rebuilt by Herod. Protected by ravines and steep slopes, it was ringed with walls and towers. The Romans raised a ramp on the western approach, while the garrison made daily sorties. In one clash, a young fighter named Eleazar was captured. Bassus threatened to crucify him in full view of the stronghold, beginning with the customary scourging. Hearing his cries and pleas, and his own urging that they spare him and bow to Roman fortune, the defenders' resolve broke. They surrendered on terms of clemency. Once inside, however, the Romans killed the men of fighting age, about 1,700, and sold the women and children. Those who had actually negotiated the surrender were allowed to depart, and Eleazar was set free. Bassus then ringed the forest of Judea with cavalry to seal it, sent infantry to fell the trees, and smashed repeated breakout attempts. After prolonged fighting, the entire rebel force was wiped out at the cost of only a dozen legionaries. At this stage, the emperor tightened control over Judea and ordered all Jewish territory brought under imperial authority. He also imposed a poll tax of 2 drachmas on Jews throughout the empire. Before carrying this program to completion, Bassus died unexpectedly, and command passed to Flavius Silva. Only one redoubt still held out: Masada. With the countryside subdued, Silva assembled his forces and marched for the desert fortress. Masada had early defenses attributed to a high priest named Jonathan, though some identify him as the Hasmonean king Alexander Jannaeus, known in Hebrew as Jonathan. Herod later transformed the site with palaces and massive works. Josephus says Herod designed Masada as a refuge against 2 perils: a possible uprising of his own subjects and the ambitions of Cleopatra of Egypt, who repeatedly pressed Mark Antony to remove Herod and hand Judea to her. Herod's showpiece at Masada was no ordinary refuge. He laid out a sumptuous palace on the western slope just below the citadel walls, its high enceinte braced by 4 corner towers. Inside were columned walkways, bath suites, and a warren of richly appointed rooms paved with mosaics. The summit itself was a vast rock table, roughly 600 meters from the north to south, and about half that across at its widest, hemmed in on almost every side by cliffs. To the east, the escarpment plunged hundreds of meters. The only ascent there was a narrow, twisting footpath the ancients nicknamed the Snake. From the west, the vertical rise to the crown was far lower, but again there was only a single approach. Herod had ringed the plateau with a casemate wall more than a kilometer long and about 5 meters high, studded with towers. Arsenals held large stocks of weapons, though Josephus almost certainly exaggerated when he claimed they could arm 10,000. Far more credible are the immense stores of grain and the complex water system. Dams, channels, and a chain of giant cisterns carved into the mountain to trap winter runoff. For any besieger, the logistics were brutal: desert heat, empty horizons, and long supply lines vulnerable to raiders. Command on the rock fell to Eleazar ben Yair, heir to a militant lineage. His forebears included the Galilean leader Hezekiah, cut down when Herod first rose to prominence, Hezekiah's son Judas, associated with the tax revolt of the year 6, and Judas's son Menahem, a prominent insurgent in the opening phase of the war. Around Eleazar were some 960 followers, whom Josephus variously labels Sicarii and Zealots. In practice, there were factions. The group that had briefly seized positions on Temple Mount in the first year of the revolt and later merged into John of Gishalah's coalition, and the Masada contingent, driven from Jerusalem early on and committed thereafter to rural raids and hit-and-run warfare. They dealt with Simon Bar Giora during his southern campaigns, but refused to be drawn into anything beyond operations around the fortress. Archaeology bears out a picture of families living inside a fighting camp. Many rooms within the casemate wall were subdivided into small domestic units. Ritual baths have been identified, and a synagogue yielded fragments of scripture. Strong signs that the garrison saw itself as a religious political community, not merely a nest of brigands. For Rome, leaving such a symbol intact was unthinkable. A fresh rebellion anywhere in the empire would imperil a dynasty newly come to power. In the winter of 72/73 or 73/74, the governor Flavius Silva marched with a force centered on the 10th Legion, reinforced by auxiliary cohorts, camp followers, and many Jewish slaves pressed into Porterage, altogether on the order of 15,000 people. He pacified the region, bottled the rebels up on the height, and set about the siege by the book. 8 permanent camps went up, and a continuous barrier, more than 5 kilometers of wall, encircled the mountain, even skirting sheer precipices. 2 large camps for legionary detachments commanded the main eastern and western approaches. 6 smaller posts for auxiliaries watched the remaining ground, covered likely escape routes, and, from one height, looked down into the stronghold. The camps were laid out with textbook regularity, tent streets for each 80-man century and stone-built cells for each 8-man section. Leather tents stretched above. Along the eastern arc, the blockade wall bristled with towers at short intervals. The message was clear. No one would. Starving the place out was pointless. Masada had food and water to endure for years. The only realistic option was to storm it, and that required a ramp. West of the summit, a natural spur offered the one feasible shelf. Silva's engineers raised it still higher with earth and timber, building a broad fighting platform at the top. Onto this they hauled a massive, iron-clad siege tower armed with stone throwers and bolt shooters to clear the parapets, and a heavy ram to break the wall. The defenders were not idle. Large boulders were stockpiled in key chambers along the circuit, and when the outer wall began to give way, they threw up an inner barrier designed to absorb the ram's shock. Long timbers laid in parallel were packed with earth between them and braced with cross beams. To Roman eyes it looked like masonry. In truth, it flexed under impact, deadening the blows. Silva answered with fire. Flights of incendiaries arced onto the timber and earth core. For a moment, a wind shift threatened to turn the blaze back toward the Roman engines. Then the gust swung again. The inner wall kindled, and by evening a broad breach yawned. The night watch was doubled. At dawn, the assault would go in. When the legionaries advanced, silence met them. No rush of defenders, no skirmish at the gap, nothing, until 2 women and 5 children crept out of a water conduit and told their story. According to their account, Eleazar had persuaded his people to deny Rome a victory in chains. They burned their possessions, left the food intact to show they had not yielded to hunger, and agreed on a sequence of deaths by lot. First husbands killed their own families, then 10 men killed their comrades. Finally, 1 killed the remaining 9 and himself. The Romans found bodies arranged in family groups, the great storehouses untouched. Josephus preserves a long exhortation he attributes to Eleazar on that final night, casting the choice as fidelity to God and freedom over the degradations of enslavement. Better to die together, he argues, than see wives abused, children dragged away, and men tortured, and better to leave the enemy no plunder but a testimony of abundance left behind. Modern readers rightly note that Josephus had no direct access to the council on the summit. He likely drew on the army's official report and the survivors' testimony, and then, in a choice that shaped how later ages remember Masada, recreated the scene as a dramatic set piece from within the circle of the doomed. Josephus didn't make up what happened at Masada, but he did shape how we remember it. He puts 2 stirring speeches into Eleazar ben Yair's mouth, turning the garrison's final act into a tragic, defiant set piece. That's striking, given how harshly Josephus attacks zealot factions elsewhere. One way to read it, he's using a deliberate literary contrast. Against the pageantry of Rome's victory parade, he sets a Jewish last stand, giving Masada pride of place near the end of his narrative, when he could have closed with the fall of Jerusalem alone. Even then, Masada isn't his final note. Josephus ends the Jewish war with the downfall of a Roman official who had executed thousands of wealthy Jews on trumped-up charges and hauled others off in chains. He lingers on the man's gruesome illness, a moral coda after years of brutality. In the wreckage of the revolt, Josephus himself is plainly unsettled. His homeland is gone. His loyalties and outlook are pulled in different directions. That restlessness shows on the page. Powerful, immediate writing that doubles as reportage and personal reckoning, but also wobbles at times as history and as literature. The fighting spirit didn't die with Jerusalem. Zealot circles tried to transplant their movement to other centers. Some reached Alexandria, only to be handed over to the Romans by local Jewish elites. The Egyptian temple tied to Onias was shut down in the backlash. In Cyrene, unrest flared again. A fugitive named Jonathan led poor followers into the desert with promises of signs and wonders. Denounced by the notables, he was captured, tortured in Rome, and burned alive. Militancy persisted. There were violent uprisings across the diaspora in the second decade of the next century, and then, most dramatically, the Bar Kokhba War in Judea. Between 132 and 136, a leader hailed as Son of the Star, backed by the renowned Rabbi Akiva, rallied a broad coalition. The rebels retook Jerusalem, rebuilt defenses, restored priestly service, and minted new coins proclaiming national redemption. Volunteers streamed in from abroad. The hills swarmed with guerrillas. Caves and desert fortresses bristled with resistance. It took Rome 4 grinding years and 8 legions to crush that last bid for independence. By then, Josephus had long since died in the capital he once praised and condemned in equal measure. Whatever one thinks of his choices, he left behind one of antiquity's fullest war chronicles, part victory monument for the Flavians, part elegy for a shattered people.